G'day, Paul Barclay with you with more big ideas here on RN and available for streaming or podcast via the web at abc.net.au/Radio National. Australia needs a vision of the common good where business, government and union leaders work cooperatively towards a society which shares its prosperity equitably and which tackles entrenched disadvantage. That's the view of Dr. Philip Freier, Anglican Archbishop of Melbourne. He wants a new social contract for Australia, a contract that includes a sense of mutual obligation and responsibility to one another, founded on the principles which produced the society Australia enjoyed for so long, one not threatened by greed or indifference. But what should such a social contract look like, and how do we get there? Philip Freier discussed his vision with Jed Kearney, the ACTU president, and Saul Eslake, the chief economist for the Bank of America Merrill Lynch, at a public conversation out in the open in Federation Square, Melbourne. You can have your say about this proposed social contract for Australia by visiting our website. Just search Radio National and Big Ideas and follow the prompts. But now to Federation Square and Archbishop Philip Freier.
I suppose just to open our conversation, I might just ask both of you, what do you think are the big kind of driving forces, the big engines that make the society we have like it is? Jed, first of all, how you, coming from a significant role of leadership in the union movement, how do you sort of conceptualise the Australian society broadly as you're looking at interacting with the work you do?
I think we have been very lucky in Australia in terms of social contracts, which is what we're talking about today. And I think Australians are very aware of the role that government plays in providing public service. I think we've been very lucky in terms of being able to provide decent employment and decent working conditions and trade union rights. I think we've been very lucky in terms of how we've dealt with multiculturalism and the changing society that we have. I think our institutions are fairly robust. We're lucky that we have a decent health system, despite some of its failings, and have had access to a very good education system. I think, the social contract system that we have developed in Australia is very good. Going forward, though, I think we've got some very, very major challenges that are going to challenge those constructs. And I think, we have an ageing population. We certainly have, I think, in Australia, a growing inequality, which is something that we're going to have to reassess and I think realign those institutions that deal with that. We have what I perceive as a decline in the concept of decent work. We have 40% of our workforce is now employed in some forms of insecure work, where people aren't guaranteed an income week to week, people aren't guaranteed sick leave, people aren't guaranteed paid holidays, all of those things that we've come to really rely upon to have a decent life. There's global warming, there's all sorts of issues I think that are challenging us right now in Australia, so it's very timely to have this type of conversation.
We'll come back to some of those themes as we go through the morning. So what's your take on the highest picture level of what our society in Australia looks like as you analyse it?
I think the driving phenomenon of Australian society from its European origins has been immigration. And that begun predominantly as British immigration, and we have as a result of that a British system of governance which I think has served the country well, as it has other countries who've inherited a British form of governance. But of course our culture has been so much enriched by the arrival of people from all sorts of other places around the world, and that's one of the things that makes us different from Britain. While we inherited a British legal and political system, we've managed to avoid the worst aspects of the British class structure. So we have a more fluid society than certainly Britain and the other continental European economies. We've also managed, although I'm not enough of a historian to know precisely how we've done it, to avoid some of the features of American society that, although we have things in common as a settler society and one that's enjoyed a lot of economic progress, we don't have the extremes of income and wealth distribution that Americans have. And notwithstanding the things Jed said about some of the fragility of employment and so forth that has become more noticeable in Australia, we're not at the US end of that particular spectrum either. And I think it's those things together with the historically the importance to this country of things like farming and mining that have played a bigger role in shaping our economy than most other countries. The fact that, unlike other countries which have been based on mining, in what we still refer to as developing economies, we've been able to avoid some of what's called the resources curse. We've managed to have a stable democracy without the benefits of resource exploitation being concentrated in a handful of dictators and those close to them, which has happened in many other countries that have been endowed with resources wealth. And like Ched said, I think we face a number of challenges going forward, including those associated with population ageing, possible environmental constraints on our historical patterns of growth, adjusting in the way we think as well as the way we do things to the re-emergence of China and India as big players, not only economically but politically and socially as well. And perhaps closer to home, we've got all of the challenges associated with managing what is the biggest commodities boom in our history, the mining boom that we're now going through, which has the potential to create enormous income and wealth for all Australians. But we also know from our own history that we typically don't manage to achieve that we usually waste a lot of the proceeds of good fortune such as we're presently experiencing. And there are a lot of adjustment challenges associated with avoiding repeating our history that, for example, are flowing from the strength of the exchange rate or the impact that in turn is having on economic activity and employment in the parts of Australia where most of us live.
I think it's interesting that, in a way, I think we've been very pragmatic as Australians. We've often imported, as you've observed, concepts from England, concepts from the US, other places, but often without the real ideology that sat underneath it. We've actually had a pragmatic application of policies, and sometimes policies which have probably been reasonably radical, even in an economic and a social sense. And when people have tried to drive them ideology, I don't think they've driven them ideologically. They haven't really engaged people's imaginations. We are a fairly, well, I suppose it comes out of this aspiration to be a commonwealth. We've had an aspiration in the founding of Australia that the inequalities, the abuses of an old world that people come from would be not repeated here in a new world. So there's something of an optimism about a new society, I believe, that still characterises the Australian aspiration, but it sometimes can mean we can be uncritical in some of the concepts we import from other ways. But I'm interested in this concept, I guess, of how we actually, I suppose the metaphor that appeals to me, that I've often used in other contexts, is how the rising tide lifts up many boats. This thing, I think, which probably comes from the idea of a commonwealth, that people generally will benefit in the prosperity of the country. And as we know, gaps between wealth and opportunity often erode social cohesion. Where's your take, Jed, on how we're going at being a society which is working to make sure people aren't left behind?
Well, it's very topical, isn't it? Because we have been having a conversation recently in the media following Wayne Swan's article in the Monthly about unequal influence on, I guess, our governing bodies and on society's opinions and where those influences are coming from. We have the very wealthy miners, who have lots of money at their disposal and are actually driving a lot of debate into, if you agree with Wayne Swan in terms of their vested interests.
Well, I think the man in Queensland's not going to get heard too much. The more he speaks, the less people are going to listen, I suspect.
One can only hope, Philip. That's true. But it is an interesting question, and I was on a panel recently discussing just this, and then people said, yes, Jed, but what about that dreadful trade union movement? You spent $10 million on a work choices campaign, etc. So, it is an interesting debate to have. But I think we have to be very careful. I see it at the moment that we are on a precipice, really, between what you described, that general feeling that Australians have that, wealth should be shared, that there is a role for government, that there is a role for institutions that actually support people who have less, for a fair taxation system. And it seems to me that the pendulum is kind of just trying to push us back the other way, I think, with debates now about productivity that I don't think are about productivity. I think they're about profits. People just don't understand the difference, I don't think. Or there's a deliberate attempt to shift that. There's debates about why should wealthy people pay tax. There's all these sorts of debates we're having that we're right on the precipice of perhaps we could just lose that really strong sense of egalitarianism that you think Australians have. I see it certainly in the contract between workers and employers. I think we have, for example, with work choices under the Howard years, we did lose that pendulum. It swung back a bit. We have to keep pushing it back to, I think, fair work contracts. So I certainly think that, yes, I agree with you. Australia's been very lucky. We've had a very robust sense of what we need as a society, but I get a sense we're pushing ever the other way. And Saul says we're not like America yet, where a lot of these inequalities happen. But Saul, I think what we're seeing is perhaps a move where you have perhaps 40 million working poor, as they say. You have a very poor health system. You have very little access to equal education. People pay for education. I think we have to be careful, don't you, that we're kind of heading that way. That's my feeling.
Yeah, sure. Well, sort of back to that, Saul, and your take on how we're going in terms of that broad sense of people together sharing in that prosperity.
Just to start from something where Jed finished, that historically we have a lot of reasons to be grateful to the Americans, and one of them that's relevant in this context is that they're an example of what we don't want to become in some respects. So some of the things that Jed mentioned there, we can only say in part because there's an example to look at. And I go back to the point that we're a kind of pragmatic people who are not attracted to ideological extremes. And I think that's partly because we're not a big country in the world scheme. We don't imagine that we're going to impose our values on everybody else. We can look at what other countries have done and say we like that, but we don't like that, and to some extent we can pick and choose from that. I mentioned before that this country has been built on immigration. Everyone except those who are descendant from Indigenous people have ultimately come from somewhere else. And many of the people who've come here, from the earliest convicts onwards to the most recent arrivals of refugees, are here in part because they have some experience of something horrendous that's been done in another country. And I guess that sort of collective experience of the worst aspects of political systems and human behaviour, I suspect, if only subconsciously, informs the way we think about our approaches to things. Now, having said that, perhaps as a result of our essentially unideological approach to the way we go about building and running our society, while I wouldn't pretend for a moment that we have an equal distribution of wealth, and to be honest, and Jed may have a different view on this, I don't think our society would work if we aimed for equality in outcomes. I mean, I think we should aim for equality of opportunity, no disagreement there. But at the risk of being seen as a typical economist, I think the opportunity to achieve a better standard of living than others around you, for your children or for yourself, is part of the incentives that drive some people to work harder and to achieve more than they otherwise could. People want prizes. Prizes are often, not always, but often of monetary value. Australia's a less unequal place than many of the countries we compare ourselves with. And just to quote three easy statistics, in the United States, the top 10% of the income distribution have about 48% of the income, which I think is a sort of frightening kind of statistic. And there's an obvious parallel for what the bottom 10% have. In Britain, that figure is about 40%, goes to the top 10% of the income distribution. In Australia, it's about 32%. Over the last 20 or so years, the share going to the top 10% has increased by about 15% in the United States, by about 10 percentage points in the UK, and by about 6 percentage points in Australia. So I'm not disputing either that income and wealth are not distributed equally, they're not, nor am I suggesting that inequality hasn't increased in Australia, it has, but it's increased by a smaller amount and to a lesser extent than in the two societies that in many respects are most like ours. And that's in part because the systems of taxation and income redistribution that we have in this country actually work reasonably well at fairly low cost. So, for example, we don't have a welfare system which gives money to everybody, as continental Europe does, and which requires higher taxes in order to fund. We don't have, as the Americans do, a system that pays an age pension to everyone. Billionaires are entitled to social security in the United States. That would, in a European context, mean that taxes would have to be higher in order to pay pensions to everyone, except the pension itself is pretty mean, and that's one of the ways in which they keep taxes down. Similarly, the unemployment benefit in the United States is both low, even by our standards, and it doesn't last for very long. It's 13 weeks normally if you are unemployed. So we've got a system which, although it doesn't require particularly high taxes, Australian taxes in general are low by the standards of most Western economies. Because we don't, quote, waste as much money paying welfare benefits to people who are perfectly capable of looking after themselves, we're able to be reasonably generous to those who, for whatever reason, can't look after themselves, with the possible exception now of the unemployed, who I don't think are well treated by our system. But those who are sick, those who have family responsibilities, those looking after people with disabilities, and especially the aged senior citizens, are, by comparison with countries like the United States and the UK, pretty well off. And the tax transfer system in Australia does a reasonably good job in preventing inequality being as marked as it is in countries that have fairly similar economic systems to us.
The last thing, I agree with what you've said, definitely. But I think the reason that we have a good taxation system, social protection system, that we have, people who are ageing can access a decent retirement is because we have had a concept of a good social contract in Australia. If you go take superannuation, for example, as you would know, it grew out of the union movement. People forewent a 3% pay rise at the beginning to have a superannuation established. It was an agreement a tripartite agreement between all the major employers, unions, government, etc. We understand with social security benefits that there is a social contract that you will try to get a job. Yes, I'm receiving unemployment benefits, as pitiful as they are, I think you agree. But there is an understanding that we have a contract that we will try to get a job. Yes, we are lucky, I think, at the moment in Australia, but it really does worry me when I look at what is happening overseas and you say we can pick and choose. You look at America, they have this whole concept of a big society at the moment, which basically equates to cutting public spending.
Is Britain or the...
In Britain,
yes.
Which I think is a concern. We have to look very carefully at what they are doing there and how they're constructing that. Whilst you say, yes, we have all these things, I think there are major threats to what we have that we have to be aware of. And that was my point before about we're just at a precipice, I think. We're seeing things happen on a worldwide. We are a global world and they can impact on those very good social constructs that we have. The politics of opportunity worries me, and if we have time I'd like to have a talk about that too, because you can't have opportunity if you don't have access to decent provision of infrastructure, and if there's not equal access, then not everybody has equal opportunity. Everyone has an opportunity to be ill-educated as well. So that worries me, the politics of opportunity.
I think that what raises, an important point here, that whilst our unemployment rate is low, at over 5%, the number that I've read of about 7% of people who are underemployed, who are willing to do more work but aren't able to. And you put that alongside of, I think it's estimated that about 800,000 people with disabilities in Australia, about 200,000 would be glad to be in the workforce with the right support. And then another figure that, compared to the top 5 OECD countries, we spend about 1/3 of a percentage of GDP on programs of transition to work. Things like Jobs Australia and other things like that other countries spend about 3 times as much in those top 5 OECD countries to actually increase participation and make that possible. It's on a sense, things you've said, we're running the risk of continuing, I suppose, a positive kind of welfare state, but not investing in the things which most of all will probably give people a chance to participate and then enjoy all of the social, the health, the personal benefits of participation and employment. Any reactions to that as a structural issue we need to engage with better?
You talk about acquisition of skills and investing in education. Absolutely. I think that we constantly hear the rhetoric of we need to increase participation, we need to increase productivity. These are all major issues facing Australia, and people talk about the need to acquire skills, and yet if you look at the vocational education sector, it's, in my opinion, I don't know, Saul might think, but it has been thrown at the mercy of the market. It's been privatised, and I think it's market failure in a sense where the providers actually, of course, are going to provide the most profitable courses, the most popular courses, the ones that are going to cost them the least, where they can make the most money, not necessarily the courses where you need boilermakers. We don't need hairdressers in Australia. It might be more expensive. So on the one hand, you say, yes, we need to provide this for our economy. On the other hand, you have a system that's not necessarily providing those skills or those workers that you need. And also, going back to my pet topic at the moment of insecure work, I think when you're employed in an insecure work where a large majority of people are, there's no investment in their worker, there's no investment in skills, there's no investment in safety, there's no hope for promotion, there's no hope for career advancement, none of which will actually produce, I think, a productive economy. So we have a schizophrenia, if you like, of policy at the moment in Australia that is not producing what we really need.
We might move on to that a bit later. I'll just ask Saul if he could just reflect on, I suppose, that concept. Is our emphasis on the decency of making sure we have better conditions for unemployed people than they might have in the US or other places, but are we under-investing in increasing participation and under-emphasising the value of more people being in the workforce, decently employed and experiencing all those benefits?
I think the answer to that's yes. Other things being equal, and they aren't always, individuals and society are better off if people who are willing and able to work can find work that they in turn find interesting and that enables them to live in a way that they would want to live. I don't think I'd put any other qualifications around that. And to the extent that there are people who, as you say, would like to work longer hours but can't, whatever other reason might that, aren't able to work at all, then that's a problem. And I don't really argue with the proposition that in those, it's a difficult, if I can call it that without any pejorative intent, cases, there might well be a case for more spending on making people like that job ready, in the same way that it's long been accepted that we spend more supporting children with disabilities in the school system to get an education. It may well be that you carry over the same approach to getting people with, in the broader sense of that term, disabilities into more meaningful employment. And as you say, we spend less on those kind of things and on labour market training programs more generally than many other countries with similar standards of living to us. And perhaps part of the price we pay for that is lower rates of labour force participation. As the population ages, I think increasing labour force participation will become more important in order to ensure that people actually have the workers that they need. And it may well be that as a result of that, employers themselves will take on more responsibility for doing those sort of things because it's in their own interest as well as in the social interest. I don't think that means we don't need to spend more in some of those areas, but it may well just be that people will do some of those things of their own volition, just as over the last 10 years employers have gradually changed their attitudes towards employing older workers. That's not the only reason that the employment of older people has increased, but I think employers themselves have changed their attitudes towards the skills and abilities of people towards the end of their statutory working lives in ways that have been beneficial to both.
Participation at the moment is increasing. It's dramatically increased over the last couple of decades, particularly with respect to females, to women in the workforce. And, I think the problem is not so much getting people into the workforce. I think it's actually, once they're there, making sure they have the skills that they can move up so that people can come in at those lower skilled jobs again. And that's an area that we haven't focused on.
You're certainly right that over a long period of time, participation rates of women have trended upwards. Since 2000, the participation rates of men over the age of 55, which had been falling for 20 years, have increased. I do worry that over the last year, the participation rate has actually dropped by about 0.7 of a percentage point, and I think that is disguising what would otherwise have been recognised as an increase in unemployment that will probably become more apparent this year as the economy bifurcates between a small part, mining related for the most part, that's doing exceptionally well, and parts of the economy like manufacturing and retailing and tourism that employ a much bigger proportion of the workforce that for different reasons are not going to be doing particularly well over the next 2 or 3 years.
Which is interesting because you have the miners wanting to bring in migrant labour, which is a big issue at the moment, on people on 457 visas to fill the skill shortages, and yet we have the situation that Saul just described where we have people losing highly skilled jobs in manufacturing. It boils down to the fact, I guess, at the end that perhaps I don't know, again, we haven't invested properly in apprenticeships in this country, in those industries. We haven't invested in skills. We haven't assisted people to relocate and move to where the jobs are. There's a big question there, I think, about managing that labour split that we're seeing right now.
There's also, rightly or wrongly, people don't want to go and live in Karratha.
Because labour's not as mobile as capital either.
True.
That's right.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's just, that's a matter of fact, yes. But they might go and live in Karratha if they actually built some infrastructure there, if they built some schools, if they built a swimming pool.
Having lived in far north Australia for a long time, you can do it, but certainly Melbourne has many things which are very favourable by comparison.
Indeed.
I'm interested in this because in this whole concept, and without digging too deeply into it, but in some ways, the xenophobia, the White Australia policy came out of a legitimate aspiration of workers to protect their roles from the uneven competition of cheap migrant labour or indentured migrant labour. And so, in terms of our broad social contract, I'm not accusing you of going down that direction, Jed, but you can sort of see that there is always a reality that a market is going to think of innovations when we have broadly high wage structures in this country compared to opportunities of labour elsewhere. We don't have to go that far elsewhere to find people for whom Australian wages would be enormous.
New Zealand.
Indeed. How do we manage those kinds of debates? Because I think Australia is always very easy to push over another precipice into the xenophobia and things which are not very helpful for other aspects of our social cohesion. How do you as a leader try to debate these things and bring these questions into the public consciousness? How do you feel you have to walk that line?
It is difficult, isn't it? Because often when we argue against bringing in migrant labour from overseas because of all those reasons, we try to argue in terms of the fact that we don't want it to slip into exploitation. We have an argument right now, and Saul would know it, how it wants to be constructed better than I do, but for special economic zones, for example, I think it's the miners in particular want to be exempted from having to pay market rates. Is that right? Is that they want to be able to bring in labour from China or wherever and pay them what they would be paid in China and be exempted from any of the laws and regulations, particularly around labour I'm focusing on. Whereas we would say, well, no, if you're bringing labour overseas, they should enjoy the benefits that we have here. They should enjoy our wages, our conditions, our occupational health and safety protections. But at the same time, they should be seen as a temporary measure. And that we should be training people here. We have 40% youth unemployment in some pockets. We have 50 to 55-year-old men losing jobs in manufacturing. You're right, it is a very difficult debate to have without sounding xenophobic. But the fact of the matter is that, migrant labourers should not be exploited when they come here, and we should be very mindful of the economic situation in Australia. Certainly bring over, if we need to, if we have serious skill shortages, they can be identified. We don't have workers here looking for those jobs. By all means, let's fill them with import labour. I'd love to be able to do it permanently. That, to me, would be the answer, rather than bring people over for 4 or 5 years and send them home again. But make sure that they are treated fairly, decently, and earn a decent wage while they're here. It's a difficult one, I agree.
What kind of social contract would deliver the Australia we want? What are the big driving forces shaping our society? Dr. Philip Freier, Anglican Archbishop of Melbourne, is discussing these questions with ACTU President Jed Kearney and Saul Eslake, economics commentator and chief economist for Bank of America, Merrill, Lynch, Australia and New Zealand. You're with Big Ideas on RN. Next up, the panel takes a look at the carbon tax and the need for getting the budget back into surplus or not. But first, Philip Freier addresses the issue of security of employment.
That affects some industries particularly, and there is an economic cost that Saul might want to describe for what are the trade-offs that, if there is security of employment, what is the kind of economic cost which is balanced against that as we come into this discussion?
Well, I guess what I would say about that is that I'm sympathetic to claims that unions make about some of the things that casual employees miss out on, like sick pay, holiday leave, superannuation, the fact that if there's no work, you simply don't have any income to do. I sympathise profoundly with those kind of claims. What I'm far less sympathetic to is when the quest for security morphs into what we see in continental Europe, where it's almost impossible to fire people for legitimate reasons. Now, I'm probably wouldn't disagree with Jed about the need to protect people from arbitrary and capricious dismissals. Don't have an argument about that. Have seen that happen in workplaces myself. Not experienced it personally, but certainly seen it happen. So I'm not arguing about that, but it's, I think, a fact of life in a dynamic economy that is continually having to adapt to changes in the global environment, to changes in consumer demands, to technological change, and all of the other things that are buffeting our world, that patterns of employment also need to change, that firms grow and shrink, that even within firms, particular lines of business decline, other lines grow, that different things are done in different places. And if we as a nation as a whole are to make the most of those opportunities and to have the greatest capacity to respond to adverse shocks, then we need to have flexibility. What's inconsistent with that are rigid rules governing hiring and firing. And when we look at continental Europe in particular, where rules about hiring and firing are far more rigid than they are in Australia, let alone in the United States, the labour market gets divided into insiders and outsiders. The insiders, those who have jobs when regulations regarding hiring and firing are tightened, do very well out of those. You know, they enjoy pay rises, they enjoy, quote, security of employment for as long as their employer is commercially viable. But those who are outside the system live in a world where all the things that we say about casual employment in Australia are writ even larger. And that's why, say, in countries like Spain or Italy, which have far more rigid rules around hiring and firing than we do in Australia, or than, say, Germany does, have unemployment rates for everyone of 20% and for youth unemployment of, say, 40% or higher, because people who are outside the system get locked out. And again, I think it's an economic reality that if you make people harder to fire, you'll also reduce the willingness of employers to hire them, because hiring people is inherently risky. I mean, we can't usually sum up the characteristics of a person in one or two interviews or by looking at their resume, and it just happens that from time to time people hire the wrong person for the wrong job. And if employers think that they make a mistake and it's almost impossible to get rid of them without going through tortuous and expensive legal processes, and I'm talking here about employers who are genuinely making mistakes, not arbitrary and capricious dismissals, which I do know also go on, then you're just going to have people reluctant to fire. And I think there's an element of that in the lower levels of employment participation among people who do have disabilities or who do have checkered career histories, that employers will look at that and say, I don't mean this particular person any well, but there's a greater risk associated with it, and if I don't have the flexibility to manage those risks, then I'm going to go for someone safer, or I won't hire anyone at all, I'll put in a machine. So what I'm saying is there's a trade-off between security in employment and employment more generally. In much the same way as in a broader context, there's been a trade-off which I don't think Australians have appreciated at all, between the security that we think we're getting by all the things that go on at airports, the security we think we're giving because we've given ASIO more powers to tap people's phones and their emails without warrants, or to lock people up without access to a lawyer. There's a trade-off between the security we think we've got from those and other things that we should, I think, attach some value in life. And that applies, this trade-off between security and other objectives applies whether you're talking about employment practices or aviation security or food security or energy security or anything like that. It just seems to be that if you attach the word security to something, you're almost stifling any questioning of the price that you might pay for that security.
And Jed, that's got to be an issue for the union movements, that the arguments for security don't just hold for the places with the greatest industrial leverage, but for all workers, including people who are at the casualisation end, which I suppose in Australia is arguably a bit of a response to the restrictive employment practices, a lot of corporations wanting to contract out elements of what otherwise was the work they would have directly employed people to contractors.
That's right. Flexibility. We in the union movement call it the new F word because it's the excuse for everything. I want to talk about risk, because you talked about risk. And what's happening with these new forms of employment contract that we're seeing in the name of flexibility is that all the risk of employing someone that you described is being shifted. And it's being shifted from the state or from the employer onto the individual. So now the individual bears the risk. It bears the risk of being sick, of being injured, of having to save for their retirement. All of that risk is being shifted onto the individual who can least afford it, I think, in our society, or who has the least ability to be buffered through the volatilities of the economic cycle. And that is the problem, is that you are creating a house of cards, in my opinion, an economic house of cards, because you are shifting that risk from institutions that can better afford them onto individuals who can least afford them, I think. And so that is the problem with that model. Now, in terms of being able to sack somebody, we don't have very rigid structures in Australia. Employers' business, and this is a true statistic, is more likely to burn to the ground than for an employer to actually have an employee successfully sue them for unfair dismissal. It is just not the case in Australia. If you are a smart employer, we have 3 months or 6 months probation terms where surely you could see how an employee is going to say that you need to employ someone casually purely because you might make a mistake with who you employ, I think is an indictment on the intelligence of employers, quite frankly. It is not necessarily a huge constraint, and the protections that we have there are, as Saul says, to protect people from unfairly being dismissed. We are, for our own selves, creating, as I say, I think, a very fragile economy by employing people in these terms. Now, we're not saying, Saul, that everybody gets a permanent job. We can't. We're not saying that that's the panacea or that everybody's going to be employed in a box and have a job for life. People don't want that anymore. It's a completely different society we live in now. I think people are likely to have, a dozen jobs in their lifetime now. People don't want to stay there forever. However, there are some very basic things that I think as a society we need to say, yes, these are important to the well-being of society, that people do have an income, a reliable income from week to week. That's not a big ask. They need to know that they have minimum hours. They need to have some control over their working lives, whereas right now they have none. People in these types of form of work have none. So we are seeing really solid things disappear. We are seeing volunteering disappear because people can't commit to volunteer because they don't know if they're going to work on Saturday or Sunday. And if they ring up and say there's a job today for you, they'll take it for fear that there won't be a job next week. We are seeing community sporting facilities just die because people can't commit to playing footy on Saturday anymore or coaching the kids' basketball teams. We are creating a society where people can't even really, in any meaningful term, contribute their own time to those sorts of things. And we are seeing people live anxiously. They get text messages the night before from labour hire firms, as you described, saying whether or not they have a shift the next day. They don't know right up until they go to bed whether they're going to have work the next day. To me, that is not a good social contract. You should, as a worker, say, yes, I will work hard for you, and in return, there's very few things I want, but know that I can get paid if I'm sick, if my kids are sick, know that I can save adequately for my retirement, know that I have some control over my job and that I have an income I can rely on. I don't think it's too much to ask.
So just before we open up to interaction with the audience, Saul, what's the one thing you think which is the biggest ticket item that you'd like to see us change, be open to negotiation in the social contract?
I think that there's a lot that could and should be done in the area of tax reform. I guess I'm going to try and summarise very quickly something I've said in a different context at greater length, that I'm a market economy guy. I think, if you paraphrase Churchill, that a market economy is the worst way of deciding what gets produced by whom, for sale at what price, except for every other system that's ever been tried. I'm a market economy guy. I also acknowledge that while a market economy is a great way for figuring out what and how things get produced, it's not a good way for determining how the fruits of that endeavour are distributed. And I think something that's poorly appreciated by business leaders who advocate for a more open and less regulated market economy is that if you get that, and America's an extreme example of it, and we're not down that path, you will get a much more polarised distribution of income and wealth than people are comfortable with, me included. And that in order to capture the benefits of a market economy, whilst not sacrificing the social licence within which a market economy operates, because it is a social construct, you need a fairly interventionist, if I can use that term in this context, tax transfer system to pull the distribution of income back to something that would be socially acceptable. And while, as I said before, our tax transfer system does a better job of achieving those goals than it does in other countries with similar economic structures to ours, it could do it a lot better. And I don't see that happening in the way that some other countries are now seeking to do by raising top rates of tax, because I think people will just find creative ways of avoiding paying it, as the British have realised in their most recent budget. But rather what needs to happen is a comprehensive effort to knock out most of the loopholes, exemptions and concessions that people use to avoid paying the rates of tax that they are meant to pay. And I include in that trusts, negative gearing, all sorts of other things, and I would also include in that, Jed will disagree with some of this, for example, the exemption for basic food in the GST, because although when that was put up originally 12 years ago, people thought that's necessary to protect the poor, the fact is that the top 20% of the income distribution spends 6 times as much on GST-exempt food as the bottom 20%. And although poor people do spend a higher proportion of their income on health, which is exempt from the GST, than rich folks, rich folks spend a much higher proportion of their incomes on education and financial services, which are also exempt from the GST, than people at the bottom end of the income distribution. And as Ken Henry has said on a number of times, the way to judge these things is not by the fairness or otherwise of any particular measure, but rather by the impact of the system as a whole, taking into account all of the taxes and all of the transfer benefits, pensions, family benefits and that sort of thing that pay for that. So that even if you think, for example, the GST is an unfair tax because the tax is expenditure rather than income, the right way to think about it is not, is the GST in isolation an unfair tax if it happens to raise a lot of revenue that governments can then spend on things that people think are worthwhile. It's, is the tax system as a whole fair, and is what is done with the revenue that the tax system raises contribute to a fairer outcome? And I think we can improve on that in a number of important respects.
And Jed, what's your point of concern for our social contract?
I agree with a lot of what Saul said about the tax system needs to be reviewed, particularly the loopholes. I think the danger of that is to fall into a flat tax, which the GST is. The tax system has to be truly progressive, I think, so that those that can afford to pay more tax will pay more tax, and we don't have to have the Warren Buffetts of the world, like they are arguing in America, to saying rich people should pay tax, and have everyone saying, oh, but that's the end of the world as we know it. I think, so I don't disagree, I think a taxation system is high on the agenda. But for me, a big issue is the ageing population. We sort of had a bit of a flurry there about how we're going to deal with that, when the tax base will shrink if the population's ageing and the baby boomers rapidly move out of the workforce. How are we going to care for those people? How are we going to manage that as a society? What's the new social contract around that? And of course, for me, it is this burgeoning, growing concern about the new employment contract, where all the risk is being shifted onto the individual. I don't think that's a good way to go. I think that is a danger for the economy, for society. And coupled with that are all those institutions that go towards a decent wage, which of course includes the social wage, making sure we still have a robust health system, that our public sector isn't decimated, isn't cut to pieces, that we still have a decent education system.
Well, many things we will still cover, but prompted now by your comments and observations and questions.
I have a two-part question. Firstly, how economically literate is the current attitude of governments towards budget surpluses? And the second question, and that's really a question for Saul, I've trained as an economist 40 years ago, and I don't think I ever learnt that budget surpluses were inherently evil. And the second question is, that attitude towards budget surpluses, what's the impact of that attitude likely to be towards our ability to maintain the social compact?
I think the gentleman's absolutely spot on. Eventually we will stop digging things up out of the ground. And what are we left with? We have to think about that. So what are we actually going to prop up? I think manufacturing is absolutely desperately important to our economy, and we need to make sure that we value add, as you use the term, that we can actually produce things. Without manufacturing, I don't think you really can have a stable economy. Is our manufacturing system under stress? Absolutely. The high Australian dollar that is being driven up by the resources boom is making our products expensive for overseas, our exports expensive. It is really gutting our manufacturing sector. You also said it's affecting tourism, other areas as well. So we should be actually thinking about how we can maintain our manufacturing sector, how we can be smart about what we manufacture. Let's look around and see what we can actually maintain in our manufacturing sector and support that. And, I've spoken to manufacturers who are saying, OK, I can't make spare parts for cars anymore, but hey, I can make plastic cups or whatever. We should be assisting manufacturers to actually change and diversify. I think that's important. We've got to invest in skills. We have to actually make sure that people have the skills. The big mining companies, they don't take on apprentices. They don't train people. They're not investing for the future when we stop digging things up out of the ground. The issue of a sovereign wealth fund, the only way we're going to get enough resources from the mining boom to have a sovereign wealth fund is to tax them properly. So there's this big debate about the mining resource rent tax right now. I cannot even believe there's a debate. To me, it's a no-brainer. It's not really the one we've settled on. Saul would know more than me, but my understanding is the one we've settled on simply won't give us enough for a sovereign wealth fund. I don't have a problem with sovereign wealth funds. The thing is, they can't be all things to all people. They are used, as you say, in the Nordic countries to control the dollar, the fluctuations in the dollar. There's a lot of argument for that, but you need a hell of a lot of money to do that, don't you, I think?
It's curious. I mean, in a sense, the idea of a mining tax, as I understand it, is an entirely orthodox economic policy to smooth the operation of an economy, an integrated economy, so that something which is going quickly, and we've had other examples in the past with the regulation of labour in the wool industry and other times. It just seems to be that in the particular political environment of Australia at the moment, it's turned into almost an impossible concept to be sold, even though it's economically a very orthodox thing to do in the light of different parts of the economy going very fast and others going very slow. So we might, if we have time, hear some people's views on that. But that just seems a peculiar thing to me, that something which isn't particularly radical economics
you wouldn't find an economist in the country, I think, who would question the orthodoxy, to use your phrase, of taxing rents. Now, rent in economics has a particular concept that's different from what you pay on a house. But it's essentially profits that you get for reasons other than your own effort and invention. In other words, when it applies to mining, natural resources are owned by the state. They weren't put there by mining companies.
That's right.
Mining companies certainly take on considerable risks and expend a lot of effort to get them out of the ground, and they're entitled to a profit that reflects the risk on that. But where they're getting additional profits through no particular risk-taking or effort on their part, simply because in the world that we're currently in, China and India are doing what they're doing and willing to pay high prices themselves and forcing other people who want the same minerals to pay high prices as well. There's an unimpeachable economic case for capturing more of those rents, as we call them, through an additional kind of super profits tax. And the problem, I think, was that Kevin Rudd and Wayne Swat made an absolute hash of selling that proposition to the public.
Well,
partly, I think, because they sat on the Henry report. They got it just before Christmas 2009, sat on it for 6 months, and then pulled 10 out of 134 recommendations, said, this is what we're going to do. If they'd actually released the report when it was handed to them and said, this is Ken Henry's report, comment on it, and there were some flaws in the proposition, that conceptual, practical flaws in the proposition that Ken Henry put. It was very theoretical. It had, I won't go into these here, but it relied on assumptions about the way in which financiers would look at a government promise to repay losses in failed mining ventures that just had no grounding in reality. But you could have identified all those flaws and come up with something better. The simplest thing to have done would have been to say the petroleum resource rent tax, which the Hawke government brought in the late 1980s. Craig Emerson, the current Trade Minister, was one of the architects of that when he was working in Bob Hawke's office. That's been around for 20 years. It clearly doesn't act as a disincentive to investment in the offshore petroleum industry, because there's plenty of that going on. There's 200 billion of it going on. We will just extend that to other onshore minerals. Would have been an easy thing to do. And instead we've got this kind of botched thing which halved the rate of tax, only applies it to coal and iron ore. I don't often agree on economic things with the Greens, but I agree with them absolutely at why, for example, isn't it applicable to gold? When gold's trading at $1,800 an ounce, and in most of the mines in Australia it costs less than $500 an ounce to dig it up. So, but obviously this just comes down, as most compromises do, to the exigencies of politics.
I agree with you. They didn't sell the tax, and even Ross Garno said they, I think, agreed with you about the Browns tax, or the petroleum tax was the way to go. They could have had some massaging there, some consultation. But the point of the fact of the matter is that it comes back to who influences policy in this country. Is it the wealthy miners have just influenced what everybody agrees? Everybody, I think, that is an orthodox, as you say, thing to do. And yet,
well, the irony there, Jed, is it wasn't really Clive Barber, Twiggy Forrest and Gina Rinehart who rolled the government over the mining tax, even if, Gina could stand on the back of a truck in Forest Place in Perth and say act the tax. It was actually the big mining companies who overrode the mining tax more than those three folks.
Can we come to the difference in occupational health and safety opportunities? And perhaps Jed might have some views on this.
Right, there is research after research to prove that occupational health and safety incidences are much higher when you have a casualised workforce. It's really a no-brainer. They don't get access to ongoing education. They work in workplaces irregularly, so they're not familiar with the work site, with the workplace. There's a whole myriad of reasons why it is the case. It is one of the great casualties, I think, of a casualised workforce, is that people are susceptible to occupational health and safety hazards.
I don't think casual employees should be entitled to any less than permanent employees when it comes to things like OH&S protection, holiday leave, long service leave, superannuation entitlement, sick leave and all those sort of things. Where I do disagree respectfully is that I'm not sympathetic to demands for greater guarantees about the continuity of employment.
Budget surplus and the current, at least political orthodoxy, that this is an unparalleled virtue. What are your views around this thinking? Because I would have thought the impact, I'm advised, is likely to fall very heavily to state governments, and we will soon see, if we're not seeing it already, the diminishment of state government services that they can afford to provide. We'll see an increasing competition about wage claims of state governments being unable to meet. Where's the wisdom behind our current political debate?
When the economy is going well, you should be running budget surpluses, not for their own sake, but so that when things are not going so well, which they inevitably will at some point, you have the capacity to draw down on those in order to support an economy through difficult times, as the government did during the financial crisis. Now, we have been running budget surpluses, well, governments have sought to run budget surpluses for most of the last 15 or so years, because until the financial crisis, we were enjoying a good economy. It's been 20 years since the last recession. There's almost no other country in the world that can say they've gone on for so long. And Australia was well served in this respect by the emphasis that governments have placed on running budget surpluses, because we were able to do what we did without raising the need for subsequent austerity in order to get the public finances back on a sustainable footing, which the United States and Europe have both had to do because, except for a couple of years during the Clinton administration, the US and Europe continued to run budget deficits all the way through the good years. They weren't laying up grain in the granary during the fat years, so that when the lean years came, there was no grain in there, and now they still haven't got any grain in that. So that's why they're doing austerity, is because they mismanaged the boom times in a way that, rightly or wrongly, we didn't. Now, the government's insistence on returning the budget to surplus by 2012-13 is solely politics. They don't want to go to the next election open to the charge from the opposition, which the opposition will make that not once since coming to office in 2007 has the Labor government presided over a surplus. And they obviously think that that's something that will stick if they don't do it. So it's only politics. There's no economist in the country who would say that the government had done a bad job if there were a small deficit in 2012-13, or that we didn't return to surplus by 2014-15 or so, rather than 2012-13.
You've been listening to Big Ideas on RN and a public debate on whether Australia needs a new social contract. Your guest panellists tonight were Dr. Philip Freier, Anglican Archbishop of Melbourne, Jed Kearney, ACTU President, and Saul Eslake, Economic Commentator and Chief Economist for Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Australia and New Zealand. That's it for today. Thanks to the Big Ideas team for all their hard work in what's been an especially busy week. Producers Ian Coombe and Karen Zavanovitz, and technical producers Peter McMurray and Jim Usher.